Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brent Orrell, and I'm a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where my research focuses on workforce development and criminal justice reform. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation about a recently released AEI report on the topic of worker transition and retraining programs. Particularly since the turn of the century, American policymakers have grown increasingly concerned about how trends in production, automation, and trade are impacting American workers, especially in the manufacturing sector. By one estimate, between 1980 and 2017, the US lost some 8 million manufacturing jobs. In 1960, manufacturing made up 28% of the US workforce, and today it's just 8%. The past 2 decades have been particularly difficult for manufacturing workers. Between 2000 and 2017, the US lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, over twice the number lost between 1980 and 2000. Forecasters expect this trend to continue with increased automation and rising productivity, resulting in strong levels of US production, but declining levels of employment. Those are some of the numbers. But AEI scholars like Tim Carney and Nicholas Eberstadt have helped us understand the human toll associated with the loss of reliable, long-term manufacturing and employment opportunities for both individuals and communities. In Alienated America and Men Without Work, these authors helped us understand what happened when America's industrial towns and cities lost their industries. Family stress, atrophy of community institutions, addiction, idleness, and a wave of what became known as deaths of despair. Our failure as a nation to adequately plan and prepare for these transitions to transition these workers to productive jobs has imposed a very high cost on individuals, families, communities, and the nation as a whole. And I regret to say, the story of manufacturing, higher productivity, and lower levels of employment may be coming to a sector near you. It's worth noting that while employment has not fully rebounded from the COVID-19 recession, the nation's total level of economic production is almost back to where it was prior to March 2020. In other words, despite an increase in unemployment from 3.5% to 6.1% in April of 2021, we are producing almost as many goods and services as we were before the pandemic. The productivity of American workers, especially as it's been augmented by technology, remains a wonder of the world. It's also a warning of potential work dislocations to come as businesses of all types continue to invest in labor-saving technology. Our workforce will continue to need upskilling and reskilling to gain access to the family-supporting jobs and wages they need. The main challenge we face is that while our economy is rapidly evolving with all sorts of unpredictable effects on jobs and careers, the public systems that are meant to buffer employment dislocations have hardly changed at all. As one of today's speakers, Mason Bishop, likes to say, when it comes to our workforce development programs, we have a New Deal system and an iPhone economy. Our conversation today is designed to better understand the lessons learned from the past several decades about the need for improved approaches to worker transitions and to consider policy options for helping workers to adapt to technological change. Our speakers are eminently qualified to help us do that. The paper we will be discussing was authored by Rachel Lipson, Director of the Project on Workforce at Harvard's Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy, and Professor David Deming, the Director of the Wiener Center, as well as a number of their colleagues. Rachel's work focuses on policy and research at the intersection of education and labor markets. Prior to joining the Wiener Center, she worked for Europe, a nonprofit organization promoting work and career opportunities for disadvantaged and disconnected populations in partnership with American businesses. She was also a strategic advisor to JP Morgan's philanthropic arm, helping to shape its investments in human capital development. David Deming is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is the faculty director of the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy and a research associate at NBER. His research focuses broadly on the economics of skill development, education, and labor markets. He is currently serving as a co-editor at the American Economic Journal and is the principal investigator, along with Raj Chetty and John Friedman, at the CLIMB Initiative, an organization that seeks to study and improve the role of higher education in social mobility. Our respondent is AEI visiting fellow Mason Bishop. Mason is also the owner and principal at WorkEd Consulting, where he works on federal and state workforce development and higher education policies, practices, and programs. Specifically, he focuses on post-secondary training and credentialing, as well as entrepreneurship and workforce development tailored to the high-tech economy. Mason served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training at the U.S. Department of Labor from 2001 to 2007, during which time he led national workforce policy efforts and initiatives and helped lead key workforce investment programs, including trade adjustment assistance and other dislocated worker programs. Earlier, he coordinated legislative efforts at the state level to create Utah's Department of Workforce Services, one of the most highly integrated and effective workforce systems in the country. In a moment, I'm going to hand this off to Rachel and David to provide an overview of the report, The Search for Stability, a review of worker transitions. Following their presentation, I'll turn to Mason for his thoughts on the issues that Rachel and David have highlighted. Following Mason's participation, we'll shift to a conversation among the four of us before we turn to you, the audience, for questions and answers. You can send those questions, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, either to Anik Joshi at aei.org or tweet them to hashtag AEI on workers. So, Rachel, kick us off and take us through the report.
First of all, thank you. Thank you so much, Brent, for hosting us today and for supporting this work. We're really looking forward to being able to discuss this with all of you. And before I get going, I do want to recognize our co-authors. Of course, David Deming is here with us today, but we were also benefited from the invaluable contributions of Jaren Chang, Jacob Greenspan, Stephanie Nussbaum, and Mariano Paro, who worked on this report with us. So just wanted to give them some acknowledgement as well. Next slide, please. So here's the agenda for our brief remarks this afternoon. The Search for Stability paper proceeds in 4 sections, so we'll be mirroring that structure and then very briefly share key findings from each of those chapters. I'm going to begin by highlighting just a few of the key shifts affecting worker displacement in the U.S., although that could be a subject of a presentation just on its own. Then we'll share some of the big picture findings on how the U.S. approaches job loss and worker transitions and the types of programs that exist right now to support workers in finding new work. Third, I'll share some of the key takeaways from our survey of the research literature for lessons about efficacy and the record of what we know now about worker transitions here in the U.S. as well as a bit internationally as well. And then for the final section, I'm going to turn over to David to share some thoughts on the implications for future research and highlight topics where we think there's a lot of potential for further study that could help lessen the shock of economic change on the workers of the future. Next slide, please. And we can move on to the next one as well. So moving into just the first section here, I first want to say, when we started drafting this report in the winter of 2019, 2020, it was hard to imagine at that point in time how dramatically the world was about to change. This question of how to successfully transition workers across roles, employers, and industries, it's clearly no longer theoretical and has been a pressing matter of discussion over the past month and years. Just to show you some quick data from the COVID crisis to ground the conversation today. This comes from Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker. And what you can see on this slide is that while employment rates have largely rebounded to pre-COVID levels for high-wage workers, they remain significantly lower for low-wage workers. And I mean, for me, what I see here, these are the workers for whom worker transitions are and will be the most important right now and in the coming months and years. And I think it just emphasizes how important the questions tackled in this report are for the present and the future. Next slide, please. So the report begins just by outlining some of the key shifts that have been affecting worker displacement in the US, some of which Brent referenced in his introductory remarks. And we make the case that even before COVID, ongoing structural changes in the economy posed major challenges to job stability of a large subset of workers in this country. As the graph from Robert Lawrence's work shows here, the share of manufacturing employment in the U.S. has fallen over time. And Brent referenced in his comments a number of the factors that have been contributing to that change, whether it be trade, technological change, changes in productivity growth, product demand for manufacturing goods. In addition to this decline, David has done a lot of work, as well as others, on how the skills are changing concurrent to this. The fastest growing jobs in our economy require both technical and social skills. Meanwhile, the COVID crisis has really wreaked some additional havoc on the labor market. We're seeing disruptions in large shares of employment in whole industries and occupational categories, and jobs in certain education levels, and also certain racial groups have been disproportionately affected by those changes. Next slide, please. There are also geographic undercurrents to job loss that we focus in on in the report. So we reference Enrico Moretti's work on the Great Divergence, which just highlights how opportunities have been looking different in different US cities and regions, and your zip code in a lot of ways has affected the types of jobs available to you. The image on the screen is drawn from Otto Dorn and Hansen's work on the China shock. This is notable research for many reasons, but among them, this idea that actually labor markets may not be self-correcting from exogenous shocks in the way that traditional economic models have predicted. So in their work, they found that there were long-run effects on wages for areas that faced Chinese import exposure. And this was even a decade after the initial shock. So perpetuating struggles for workers who live in those regions being able to find quality jobs. Next slide, please. It might seem obvious, but one of the other things we wanted to do in setting the framing for the report is to understand how job loss affects people, because this is, of course, an important factor that should affect the approaches that we take to support workers in transition. Basically, the takeaway here is that a layoff is not just a temporary blip in a worker's career. There are long-term earnings losses, and those are even more pronounced if you lose your job in a recession. So this image on the screen looks at work from Davis and von Wachter, men 50 years or younger with at least 3 years of prior job tenure. And what you can see here is it's notable, even 20 years after that initial displacement event, their annual earnings have not fully recovered. And again, those effects were more pronounced in if you lost your job during a recession. Next slide, please. The impact of job loss, of course, though, is not just on earnings, as we heard from Brent. And if anything, the past year has illuminated the physical and mental health impacts. Prior research has found that displaced workers experience a 50 to 100% increase in mortality rates the year following displacement. And again, long run effects, 10 to 15% higher mortality as much as 20 years after the displacement event. Job loss is also associated with increased risk of hospitalization, anxiety, depression. And there's research showing that the loss of employer-sponsored healthcare can also have an adverse effect on health outcomes. Next slide, please. And as Brent referenced, I thought quite eloquently, The individual level may not be always the right frame to think about this as well. So job loss, especially when it's concentrated, has a significant impact on the surrounding community. It may undermine community social capital. We've seen from research that areas of concentrated unemployment are correlated with higher rates of crime, other negative externalities. The image on the screen from Kerwin Charles' work shows that declining local manufacturing employment is actually associated with rising opioid use and deaths. And it's a large, statistically significant relationship between opioid prescriptions and a decline in an area's manufacturing share. We've also seen displacement is associated with higher rates of divorce. Children of a displaced worker perform worse in school. They're less likely to go to college. They have lower earnings. So some significant effects beyond the individual worker themselves. Next slide, please. Finally, in the report, we also look at this dynamic of long-term joblessness, which in a lot of ways can be sort of a vicious cycle. The longer a worker remains unemployed, the more difficult it becomes to get into a new job at all. So longer unemployment spells can really become self-perpetuating in some ways. We looked at some of the research evidence indicating that on the employer side, hiring managers may discriminate against the long-term unemployed due to assumptions that there are some productivity related reasons to explain why the person has been out of work. But for workers, there's also some evidence that the longer someone unemployed can't find work, the more discouraged they become and the less intensively that they search for a job. So this was some context we also thought was important to consider as we now evaluate the approach to how do we deal with this problem and what are the efficacy of different approaches look like. Next slide, please. So this is actually a quite lengthy section in the paper. I'm going to try to run through it very briefly for you all, but looking forward to diving into some of the programs in more detail in our discussion. Next slide, please. First, wanted to just provide some context as to what we mean when we discuss active labor market policies. So in a lot of ways in the US dialogue, you might be more familiar with what are thought of as passive labor market policies. These are things like unemployment insurance that are meant to provide a financial cushion and income support to workers who have lost their jobs. In contrast, what an active labor market policy is doing is really attempting to stimulate employment by helping workers find jobs or train for new ones or subsidizing employment. And so we focus most of our work in this report on active labor market policies and understanding what are the current sets of programs and what do we know about efficacy in those contexts. Next slide, please. And one of the findings that we wanted to highlight from our review is that the US historically has spent very little on active labor market programs relative to peers in OECD. So in 2017, the US spent 0.1% of GDP on active measures. This was the lowest amongst all OECD countries except for Mexico. 2008 was the year in which the spending peaked at 0.17% of GDP, and that is in comparison to Northern European countries spending about 1 to 2%. Next slide, please. To zoom in a little bit about what this has looked like in one active labor market program, so if you think about employment services, this is research from Wadner, and it shows you that funding for employment services has actually declined 50% in real terms between 1984 and 2017. And this had some real effects on the ground. State workforce agencies have reduced the number of local offices. So there were over 1,100 American job centers that closed between 2004 and 2020. And reductions in some of the frontline staff that served in those settings. The other thing to note is that training services in a lot of ways are not universally available through the one-stops. Really, the offices are given discretion to determine who needs it most. And in a lot of cases, that means workers who already have some background or interest in jobs that are in demand locally. In addition, aggregate spending per participant on transitioning workers has declined across the US since the 80s, although there is some substantial variation across states here, as states are spending different levels of money on supplemental spending in addition to federally funded programs. Next slide, please. So one of the unique things that we wanted to do in this report is really hone in and try to understand what we call the worker transition journey. So we basically mapped out what are the stages that an individual worker goes through during a job loss, as well as a community that might have suffered from a major employment disruption, whether it be the pandemic or a factory closure. And we just use this as a framework to help us understand, what is the map and the set of current federal programs that are available right now to support workers and communities across each of these stages. For the sake of time, I won't go through this in detail right now, but we hope that this can be a helpful tool for policymakers in thinking about the worker transition experience and how to prepare and respond to disruptions. And in a lot of ways, I think in the US, this top level of the worker, the individual worker, has really been the focus, less so in terms of programs that are focusing on the broader community level that's been affected by a firm closure, downturn, or mass layoffs. Most of the federal investments that we mapped are people-focused, not place-based. Next slide, please. So this might be a little hard to see. We would encourage folks to check it out in the report, but in our research, we identified at least 40 different programs that include active labor market policies, including job search assistance, training, and wage assistance components across at least 12 different agencies. It's notable here that most of the US's worker transition programs are described and categorized based on the beneficiaries they serve. So demographic or special attributes, including individuals, with a lot of focus on individuals facing what's often called barriers to employment. We segmented those into 10 primary groups that we could find programs that map to. Those include low income, prolonged absence from employment, limited literacy or English language ability, veterans, single parents, seniors, homeless and foster care youth, individuals with disabilities, the returning population, and Native Americans. And another thing I think that's notable that I just wanted to call out here is that in the US in particular, the country has focused in some ways on what is the source of a job loss. So this is unique compared to peers in OECD. US programs emphasize in particular dislocated workers, and especially those who have been impacted by trade. And trade impacted workers, particularly through the TAA program, are eligible to receive more training, longer unemployment benefits, and other more generous service provision. And then, the other thing that we dive in more deeply in the report is really a focus on looking at the Trade Adjustment and Assistance Program, as well as the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Outside of the higher education system and Pell Grants, these are really the two primary federally funded programs that are specifically responsible for training of dislocated workers. Next slide, please. So in this third section, we do our best to survey the findings from the research literature on the efficacy of worker transition programs in the US, and are looking to summarize what's been learned from recent studies, particularly in a US context, but also incorporating some examples internationally as well. Next slide, please. And so, one of the things we find is that job search assistance and employment services, at least traditionally, are cited as having the strongest evidence base in the American context. So there's been a number of evaluations, which we cite in more detail in the report, that have found positive impacts of these programs, which include services like resume assistance, interview preparation, employment counseling, and referrals. That they've had a positive impact on the duration of unemployment, so helping individual workers return to work more quickly, and that generally they've been found to be cost effective. The image you see on the screen here is from Manoli et al. 2018, and the authors are looking at the long-term effects of an intervention implemented by Nevada in the second half of 2009, in which some unemployment insurance recipients receive personalized job search assistance at the beginning of their UI spells, and the treatment group got this report, the control members did not. And while both groups saw declining earnings during the Great Recession, those that received job search assistance saw higher incomes for both individuals and for their families compared to the control group. Next slide, please. However, we also cite and dive in the report some of this literature on displacement or equilibrium effects. And, my take is that this poses some significant questions about the overall impact of job search assistance. The way to think about this is that offering job search assistance may actually be playing the role of just transferring job opportunities from one set of individuals to another. So you could think about it like a phenomenon of musical chairs. So for instance, if one group receives counseling and another group does not, are you creating a displacement effect where the job search assistance services are actually just kind of coming at the expense of those who did not receive those services? On the screen, you can see evidence from a study of job seekers in France. There was a randomized control evaluation of 235 communities across 10 different regions. And while those participants who received job search assistance did find jobs more quickly, the authors found little net benefit from the program overall, as basically what seemed to be happening is that the program participants essentially are getting jobs at the expense of other similarly educated workers in their labor market who didn't benefit from receiving that intensive counseling or support. The other thing to note here is that those gains receded over time. Next slide, please. So in a lot of ways, you could think about training as looking at training alongside job search assistance, and they have different pros and cons and benefits and advantages. A lot of the literature on training programs in the US context really shows some mixed results. We go through a number of the evaluations in the report in more detail. And certainly one of the things to note in terms of training is that there are higher upfront costs. And often because training actually takes you out of the labor market, there's negative or neutral short-run impact. But the important thing to note about training is that is the long-run implications. And so whereas job search assistance in some ways might be just helping one worker cut the line in front of another, and it's individually beneficial, it might not scale. And in contrast, skill building interventions like training can scale because you're investing in the human capital of the workforce. Some of the most compelling evidence that we found in our review was from the Kluve, Cardin, Weber meta-analysis. They looked at over 200 studies of active labor market programs across 47 countries. And they found the largest average gains for training, particularly for dislocated workers, in fact, and the programs that emphasize human capital accumulation. Another paper that we highlighted in our review is this Hyman working paper from 2018 that looks at trade adjustment assistance. And it's notable because it does find some different results compared to some of the other evaluations of TAA. In a lot of ways, it's a more comprehensive evaluation of data. It looks at 300,000 workers from 20 years of TAA participants. And it uses a pretty unique methodology in which he compares workers before and after job displacement. And he takes advantage of this quasi-random assignment of the TAA certification evaluators to basically isolate the effects of TAA participation by looking at a group of similar workers, one of whom was approved for TAA and one of whom was not. And the study finds large initial returns for TAA participants. After 10 years, they have approximately $50,000 higher cumulative earnings relative to all else equal workers who don't retrain. And they do forego income while training, about $10,000, but it does appear over those 10 years that they're paid a premium for their newly acquired human capital. It is important to note, though, that these initial returns do look like they dissipate after the 10-year mark. And at that point in time, the earnings between the participants and the control group tend to converge. Next slide, please. Finally, a theme that seems to come out in the literature is that kind of the combination of supports that can assist navigation and training and coaching seem to make a difference. So this is from the We Owe a Gold Star evaluation in 2017 in Fortson. They found significantly higher earnings for participants that received training and core and intensive services, so including coaching and support from job centers, and that was not the case for workers that received training alone. So I think this is getting at the importance of kind of those navigational supports. Next slide, please. Finally, in the paper, we do a deep dive into one of the more promising retraining approaches, which is often referred to in the literature as sectoral employment programs or sector-based training programs. These programs are notable for a number of factors. One is that rather than offering referrals to training in any preferred field, they focus on specific in-demand industries in the local labor market where there is a high concentration of good jobs. And in a lot of ways, they're reliant on staff that have sector-specific expertise, an up-to-date understanding of skills requirements and training for jobs in the sector, and are building strong relationships with local employers in the industry. You can see on the screen some of the programs we dove into in the report that have been evaluated in relatively rigorous research settings. They span a wide range of industries and geographies, including places like Jacksonville, Phoenix, the Bronx, Milwaukee, and San Antonio. Next slide, please. We also, in the report, attempt to kind of look at these programs and try to understand what are the common elements or common themes that we see across the sectoral employment settings. So the underlying theory, I think, that the programs are more effective when job preparation and placement and training are aligned with employer needs, seems to at least be represented in these evaluations, that they are demand driven, and that there is a higher likelihood then that the participants who complete can find employment in that high potential sector where they were trained. The successful programs also really feature key wraparound supports that are complementing training and are helping assist those participants through the program and through their early days on a new job. So it could include childcare, access to housing and transportation, food assistance, all the types of things that affect someone's ability to persist and complete training, as well as once they're in a new role. We saw across all of these programs as well a focus on social skills in addition to kind of occupational training. So all were in some way offering kind of career readiness services, coaching, emphasis on teamwork and cohorts here that you see as well to kind of build those social and collaborative skills that are needed for success in the workplace. So instead of only being self-paced, we saw that they were really building a program that kind of prepared their participants for the skills that we're going to meet in the future. We think that these approaches have a lot of promise, and we pull out in the report what we think can be replicated in other settings. So let me pause there, and I'm going to hand it over to David for the final section to talk about through some of the implications that we think this report poses for future research. David, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. You can go to the next slide, please. And thanks, Rachel, and thank you to the AEI team, Brent, and everybody else for having us. It was fun to write this report, and we learned a lot, and hopefully it's useful to everybody. Thought I would just set the table for Mason's discussion and for the questions by kind of going back to what we think we've learned from this, highlighting some key points, and then teeing up a discussion of the future of this important space. So I think what we've learned is through our work is that something we kind of all know, but it's useful to document, which is that the nature of work is really changing quite rapidly, and people have to move up a job ladder where the rungs are kind of shifting positions over time. And that we're seeing a sort of pattern of increasing economic disruption, structural change, the decline of manufacturing jobs, the nature of work really changing. And at the same time, the harm that comes to workers from losing a job is really quite severe, and they often don't recover. And moreover, the longer it takes somebody to find a job, the worse they tend to do, not just economically, which is kind of mechanical, but also in terms of social impacts, depression, opioid use, things like that, and the kind of scarring effects of graduating into a recession or taking a year to find a job when you're dislocated are quite severe. And anything we can do from a policy standpoint to help those folks is probably going to pay for itself and probably going to be very high return. And yet, when we look at how the US does with so-called active labor market policies, we spend about a fifth of what other OECD countries do. So we're really not investing in this area. The US labor market is renowned for its flexibility. That's a good thing, but sometimes you need to build in a little bit of structure for folks who've had the misfortune to lose their jobs, often through no fault of their own. And so the question is how to do that. So I think the fact that we don't spend very much and we have a kind of outdated system is a big problem, but it also presents a real opportunity because we can almost design something from scratch relative to what other countries are doing. And so how should we do that is the real question. And so I just want to highlight three trade-offs here. One is this trade-off in job training programs between what I'm going to call foundational skills versus vocational skills. Right? So on the one hand, you might think of it as workers need a solid foundation of skills that apply in all kinds of jobs. This could be social skills, like Rachel mentioned, the ability to work in a team. Some recent work I've done talks about the role of being able to make independent decisions and have autonomy on the job and leading to career earnings growth. Things like that, skills that are kind of transferable. And so the question is, are there workers who need training in, and if you want to think in a more kind of baseline sense, like workers who come to this country who mostly work in back office jobs, but the ability to speak conversational English would allow them to work in front office jobs. So something like that really unlocks a broad range of jobs versus training for some specific vocational profession that maybe is useful today, but might change or might be highly dependent. You know, you get trained to do a particular type of thing that is highly dependent on one employer in your town continuing to employ you and others. And there's a kind of trade-off there between training people for the jobs they need right away versus a kind of lifetime. And if you ask workers versus employers, you're going to get different answers as to how we should do that. I think the second one is thinking about programs that focus on job search assistance. So the idea that there's jobs out there, we just have to help people find them and kind of playing matchmaker in the economy versus programs that really focus on skill building, that focus directly on human capital. So giving people skills they don't have, which is more costly and more time intensive, but also ultimately can kind of upgrade the skill of the workforce rather than just kind of helping people cut the line in terms of which jobs they get. As Rachel mentioned, some of these job search assistance programs have promising short-run effects when you just look at the individual who receives it. But often the way that happens is they basically get a job instead of somebody else. And so when you try to scale it up to the kind of economy-wide level, it doesn't create the gains you see at the individual level because you're just kind of moving the deck chairs around, playing musical chairs for jobs. And then I think the third thing is this kind of idea of a delivery model. Like, how do you want to give these services? And you kind of these sectoral employment programs that Rachel mentioned have extremely high economic returns. They're also quite expensive and intensive and are often done in person, right? So they're kind of cohort models where you bring people in, you really intensively invest in them for a period of time, 9 months or longer, versus lighter touch interventions where you maybe serve people with an app or you give them some kind of online job training. It's less expensive, it's less effective, but then in terms of cost effectiveness, where do we come out? And so I think those are real challenges we face looking forward to the future. I don't have all the answers. The report gives some of them. I think our answers are you do want to focus on foundational skills more than you might think. That also you want to focus on skill building rather than job search assistance. And that oftentimes a high touch intervention like a sectoral employment program does work very, very well, even though it's more expensive, because it's kind of an arduous process to really learn skills and get retrained for a new job. And it's something that's unlikely to be done well on the cheap. So those are our conclusions, but I think these are all very much open areas. I look forward to Mason's thoughts and the thoughts of others. Thank you.
So it's my turn, I guess, Brent.
Sorry, I was struggling for my mute button. Yes, I'd like to hear some of your high-level thoughts based on what Rachel and David have told us so far today?
Well, I'll try to keep them high level, Brent, and not bring down this wonderful conversation. First, I want to thank Rachel and David for their work. I already have used their study. I testified a month or so ago to Congress on trade adjustment assistance and was able to use this report fresh off the presses as nice evidence and background for some of my comments. So I want to thank them and their colleagues for all the work they put in. It's terrific work. I'm going to start my comments with a story, and I'm going to then end with the same story. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary back right around 2006, I was in charge of coming up with TA reauthorization principles for the George W. Bush administration and for Secretary Chao at the Department of Labor. And right around that time, Representative Dave Camp had a big whirlpool layoff in his district in Michigan. About 300 people were laid off, very traumatic to the community and to the individual workers. So they had me come out and present. And so we went to a community college, and it was a gym, and I presented, here's trade adjustment assistance, and other people were there to help. And I'll never forget, after we were all done and everybody was sort of mingling, I had a couple come up to me. At the time, I was in my 30s. This was, 15 or so years ago. And this couple was probably in their late 50s, maybe 60 time frame. And they looked a little weathered and a little beat down. And they came up to me and they said, "What do we do?" And they were the sweetest couple. And the husband said, "I'm thinking of going back to training. What do you think?" And I said, "Yeah, I think you ought to take a look at what the college offers." And also, I turned to the wife and I said, "Are you going to go to retrain?" Because they both worked at the Whirlpool plant. She said, "Well, I hadn't really thought about that," and such. And it really hit me, and it's always stuck with me, this story of that level of trauma and lack of hope and direction that people have when they have these kinds of events occur in their communities. And it really focused my thinking around TAA in particular at the time, and has continued to really influence how I view these programs. So I think the notion of the damage that is done to long-term unemployed, we can never understate. And that we really do, I think, as a nation, in particular, if that long-term unemployment is due to something like global trade or globalization, I think we do have a commitment to helping those people. And in fact, if we're going to make federal investments in job training, seems to me that's exactly the type of market failure, so to speak, that we ought to be investing in. That leads me really to my second point that Rachel and David touched on, which is really the lack of a federal strategic approach over time to worker dislocation. You saw a couple of their charts. I'm somebody who continues to hammer this message as much as I can. And in their report, they talk about the states being the laboratories, but at the same time, the lack of, I guess you could say, federal investment. Well, I would go so far as to say that the question is not only how much are we investing, but how are we investing? Because the reality of our job training and worker dislocation programs at the federal level is, while the states are the laboratories of democracy, we're so overly prescriptive in our federal laws that we actually, in some cases, I'm afraid, create disincentives for meaningful ways to help workers. TAA, I think, is the perfect example where I came to the realization, again, 15 or more years ago, that in many ways we sort of inadvertently keep people out of the labor market in TAA, because in order to qualify for job training, to qualify for extended unemployment benefits, they have to remain out of the labor market. And we don't accommodate, like we did in welfare reform in the 90s, these meaningful transitions from job training and benefits that people can get as they ease back into the labor market. And I think that's an area we really need to do a much better job in many of our worker dislocation programs. Is it's not this all or nothing. You're down and out and tough on your luck and you get all these resources, or you get a lower wage job than what you had pre-layoff and you get nothing. And I think we really need to think about how we do this, and that we really need a federal strategic approach, not this reactive approach we always have when there's a traumatic economic event in this country and say, well, we need to layer another program and layer and layer another one. And then we have this hodgepodge of stuff that nobody can do anything with at the state and local level. The third point I wanted to make is on sectoral approaches. I really appreciate the fact that Rachel and David and their colleagues identified this. And my experience has been that I think we struggle with a couple things when it comes to sectoral approaches from a service delivery standpoint. One is I find that there's often a lack of definition of understanding of what a sector approach even is. I think a lot of times in workforce development, if I may be so blunt, we kind of tend to be trendy. And what I mean by that is there's a buzzword, apprenticeship's one right now that's going on. It's like, that's the thing to do. Everybody tries to latch on, and often nobody really knows how to do it effectively. I think that's happened with sectoral strategies and sectoral approaches is we say we need to be sector based, but then I've gone and looked online over time for definitions. What does that mean? What does it look like? And when does it work really well? And it's really, the information's really hard to find. I don't know if Rachel and David ran into that as they researched it, but I'm very concerned about that. Which really kind of leads me to another point, which is the whole job search assistance. And I think that's exactly right. And I think the reason job search assistance works is because we need to approach through our sectoral approaches the way people get jobs now, which it's no longer about writing your resume, looking on a long list of jobs, sending your resume into 100 different and hoping that one of them looks at it. It's really about networks. It's about job experiences. It's about mentoring. And it's about really that connectedness that people need within a community when they're unemployed. And I think whether we talk about disadvantaged youth, dislocated workers, or others, that lack of network connection really is at the heart of what they struggle with, that other people who are connected can get back on their feet much more quickly, I think. And then finally, I'll come back around to where I started, which is the Michigan story. And I really appreciate Rachel talking about that they found that we talk a lot about the individuals and not about communities. One of the other things that I came away with, in addition to the despair and the struggle that individuals face, is the struggle that communities face when this happens. And unfortunately, one of the assumptions we make with our federal programs is that everybody everywhere in the United States is sort of from a community perspective or from a workforce development board or a community college, that they have the resources and assets by which to respond to these traumatic economic events. One of the things I've learned over the last few years as a consultant that I like to remind everybody is if you go to most community colleges in the United States, they're 1 to 3 buildings, small enterprises. They're not these large Miami-Dades or Northern Virginia Community College. And it's the same thing with our workforce system. Most of them are smaller to mid-sized operations, trying to do the best they can, and they're not resourced and they're not necessarily connected themselves to the latest literature and research and evidence-based practices. They're just trying to do the best they can. And so when I came back from Michigan, I realized, often we say, we've got this layoff of 300 people, go to the community college. And I thought at the time, my goodness, what are we doing to these community colleges and to these workforce boards and others who are trying to respond to these things? And we're just assuming they have the assets and resources and the knowledge to be able to respond effectively. And so that's actually when I came up with the idea of a community college training program, which fast forward became the TAA TACT program later on under the Obama administration. But I was the one that kind of launched that idea because I thought, not only do we need to resource individuals, but I think what Rachel was kind of getting at was we need to think about how do we resource communities and how do we effectively resource and help the people who are responding to the long-term unemployed and to the worker dislocation. And I don't think we do a very good job of that at all. I think we just sort of say, if we throw lots of money at it, they'll figure it out. And often I think what we find is it's very difficult to figure it out. And so as we look to sectoral approaches like what they identified in the report that are effective, one of the things I think we need to do as a federal response a much better job of is working with smaller and mid-sized communities and institutions across the country around educating them around what are these evidence-based practices that work and how do you connect with employers effectively and how do you close that gap between the supply and demand for labor. So I will end my comments there, and again, thank them for this wonderful report. And any questions I can answer, or any more information I can provide, I'd love to do so. Thanks, Brent.
Thank you, Mason. And Rachel and David, thank you for all the work and thought you put into the report, as well as the presentations. I just want to pick up this thread that Mason was talking about. I mean, it really seems to me, and I want to get responses from all of you on this, You know, when we have a natural disaster in this country, we have FEMA, the states have their response systems, the natural disaster ahead of time, natural disaster strikes, and all of those systems activate, and a whole host of resources and money and people and skills are brought to bear to help communities respond, recover. And I just don't think we have anything like that as it relates to employment shocks. You know, we kind of have, you know, pools of money, and we can do grants, and we can, you know, we got TAA benefits if it's linked to trade. But they're just linking to Mason's point about if your response is to parachute into the community and say, well, go to the community college, that doesn't seem to me to be adequate at all. And I'm really curious, am I right about that in sort of my sense of how we respond to these things? And then what are some of the options, alternatives to do the planning side of this and to help communities and individuals sort of understand that this is not guaranteed you're going to be laid off and lose your job, your factory's going to close, and you're going to, you know, be without work, but that communities need to be thinking about their own economic transitions ahead of time. So I'm curious, does that come up in the research? Rachel, David, Mason, any of you can respond.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump with that. I think, Brent, first of all, I agree with your intuition. I mean, I think that, you know, it's not like FEMA tries to stand up a new agency or a new program every time there's a disaster. That thing exists already, and is they engage in preparedness as part of the normal course of operation, so that when there is a crisis, we can jump in and address it rather than having to build from scratch. You might say, well, what is the harm of just passing a program every time there's a big recession or some big dislocation? Well, the harm is that the money's never permanent. And when you send money to a community college, trade adjustment assistance or whatever, and it's some big grants for 5 years, it's in response to a stimulus package or something like that. The cost of that is that you don't build the kind of connective tissue between employers and community colleges and local organizations that you know, causes them all to kind of meet in the middle and create the kinds of programs that can last and provide a kind of guarantee that the funding is going to be here for a while, and that therefore the employers ought to change a little bit the way they recruit, and the colleges ought to change a little bit the way they educate and train, so that we can build pipelines from education and training institutions into the workforce. And that's kind of a trust issue. It's a local issue, and it doesn't just happen because somebody gets a big grant. It has to, and you know, when you see programs, successful programs, they take years to build. And they're not, you know, just sort of one-off things. And so I think that's the cost of doing it this way, is that we never have any guarantee that a program that, you know, has funding today is going to have funding tomorrow. And I think I personally think that's really damaging to our efforts to retrain and reskill the workforce.
Yeah, I'll just add to what David said. It in some cases it's even worse than that, because again, what I found in my experience in the last 8 years in particular, Brent, is not only do we have sort of the permanent infrastructure, but that when we do swoop in with lots of money, is again, we haven't provided the ongoing sort of technical assistance, building that needs to happen so that people who get this money can effectively deploy it in their communities. And I can't tell you how many community college doors I walked through during the TAC grant days, and they'd shut the door and say, oh my gosh, help me, Mason. I can't even get people hired at the community college to teach the courses and stuff. And so what you do have is you have a big investment like $2 billion in TAC come, and after 4 to 6 years, it winds down, and you really ask, well, how much of that ends up being sustainable after the fact? How many of those programs continue to exist? How many of those policies and approaches continue to exist? And so I think, again, it's an issue. I think what I'm hearing from Rachel and David is a plea, if I can say it this way, to say we have to examine a more comprehensive. The federal government's role right now is not adequate. It is not adequate to just say, okay, we've had COVID, we're going to dump, $1 trillion into this and then $500 million into that, and then think, oh boy, we've done a great job, we're supporting the American people. That's not happening. What we need to do is a much more consistent and ongoing approach to building the capacity of communities to be able to respond to individuals, so that, just like you said, Brent, when a new, we're not legislating a new UI program every time we have a crisis, and we've seen what a disaster that is. People can't get benefit. And so what do people spend their time doing if you're the laid off worker? Instead of spending your time thinking forward and thinking, how do I get back on my feet? You're spending your time being completely reactive. Oh my gosh, I can't get my UI eligibility established. I can't get money. It's going to take the state 3 months to get me a check. How am I going to feed my family? That sort of thing. And so we really make it the worst of all worlds because of the lack of preparation, I think, based on what you said, Brent.
You might even call this a jobs infrastructure need,
yeah,
since we're in infrastructure season. I mean, I think I'm in violent agreement with Mason's points. I think that's
it really is, David. It's almost like we need a workforce development. I mean, we have higher ed, right? And, university kind of infrastructure that's well resourced, and for the most part, it's by federal and state governments. But we really don't have kind of a consistent evidence-based workforce development infrastructure. And in fact, we have a very inefficient patchwork of silo programs that come down to the states, and they're supposed to figure out how to make it all work with a bunch of mandates in federal law kind of getting in their way, I think, often. So
the only thing I would add there is just another silo is really between the economic development actors and then the workforce development actors, which I think gets at Brent's initial question. It's a lot. Look, these problems that we're talking about, they're hard. There's not an easy solution for how do you do the retraining and get them into new jobs. But I think often for the local economic development actors, it becomes that the easiest solution is really let's try to focus on business attraction and also focus on talent attraction. Like, how do we get people to move here who have the skills that we need, versus what would it actually look like to look at the assets of the people that we have and be combining those two strategies at once of like, how do we build for the jobs of the future in this community and invest in the people who live here. And I think, unfortunately, if you look at it, how economic development traditionally has been conceived of, kind of the sets of tools and strategies that a lot of those ecosystems are thinking about are not really linking up with the workforce development side of the house. And that also comes back to, then you tell the community college, align to the local labor market, and they say there are no good jobs here. So what does that mean for us right now? And so to me, that really gets at why those two strategies have to go hand in hand.
So as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about, how do we, how would we go about resourcing it's not jobs, it's an employment infrastructure that is thinking ahead about economic transitions. And one of the things that the federal government can actually do reasonably well is collect and analyze data and project, in the work that you all do on the academic research side, about what are the transitions that we're looking at? How do we start moving toward where things are headed rather than being in this reactive mode? And that goes to a question I wanted to raise, related somewhat to David's prior work. Rachel, you referenced this at the beginning of your presentation about kind of the shifting skill mix that's needed in the workforce, and this sort of increased emphasis on skills that are not technical in nature, non-cognitive, soft skills, whatever your nomenclature is. In this report, you talk about how, we've thought of dislocation mainly in the context of manufacturing. That's the data set that we've used. Like automation has affected manufacturing, trade has affected manufacturing employment in this country. But in your report, you seem to suggest that we're also seeing a slowdown, and I don't know if that's quite the right word, but in like these high wage management, professional, and technical occupations, that these kinds of jobs, which we have thought of as being insulated from competitive pressures that lead to, or automation, or competitive pressures that lead to loss of jobs, that these jobs may be, as I said in my introduction, dislocation may be coming to a sector near you. So I'd like you to unpack that a little bit if you can, because I think it's important that people understand that this is not just about manufacturing. That's been a problem that will continue to be a challenge, but it's a spreading phenomenon within our workforce. And I'd like you to, either Rachel or David, just sort of talk about that a little bit. I mean, what does the future look like in terms of who's going to need help when it comes to transitions?
Yeah, I suppose I can take that quickly. So I think, first of all, on the manufacturing point in particular, Brent, I mean, manufacturing employment has been in long-term secular decline in the U.S. for the last half century, and the trade, opening of trade with China accelerated that decline, but was happening anyway. And so that's why manufacturing is on our minds so much, because those jobs don't tend to come back, and so you need to transition people to new jobs, because there aren't. When the factory closes, another one doesn't come. Whereas in services, if you get laid off from a retail job, you can often go find another one because that's relatively growing. And so I think that's going to continue. And that's not really it's a bad thing for the workers who lose their jobs, but it's not a bad thing for the economy. The challenge is how to get people into new jobs. And that's where I think what you see is technical skills by themselves are no guarantee of long-run employment. So I just want to make this point very clearly. If you ask an employer, what do they need? They'll say, I need somebody, and we don't have enough welders. We don't have enough HVAC technicians. And that's true, right? At a point in time, an employer needs a particular person to fill a particular job. And if they could find that person would be employed. But what happens is the technology of the job changes, and it often changes rapidly. And so if you're a worker trying to get retrained in the kind of profession or trade that will last you a lifetime, not just to the next couple of years, you're taking a big risk by getting trained in welding or HVAC technicians if there's only one firm that needs you and that firm moves to another town, because your skills are not very transferable. They're very fragile in a way. And so I think that's the trade-off that an individual worker faces, is you're going to go back to school for a year at great cost to yourself. You want to do it for something that's going to really help you in the long run, not just today. And in fact, the faster we have technological change and productivity growth, the more this becomes an issue, the more rapidly jobs change. And so you really want to get trained in the kind of thing that is future-proof, right? Skills that are transferable. What are those things? It's the soft skills, like you mentioned, teamwork, critical thinking, problem solving. We don't really know exactly what these things are. We have some evidence from sectoral employment programs that Rachel mentioned, like Year Up, that teach people these skills through the lens of employment in an industry that's fast growing. Let's say finance or healthcare is a big one, right? Because healthcare is a service that's kind of almost every town is a hospital. It's growing as a share of services. It's growing as a share of the workforce. And so it's a pretty safe thing. And so you pick a kind of sector to work in. But in healthcare, you can move from being a frontline medical assistant to a technician to maybe a vocational nurse to being an RN. And so there's kind of a potential job ladder there. But in order to move up that ladder, you need to develop the kind of soft skills that allow you to become a problem solver, that allow you to make open-ended decisions about what you should do next, and not just kind of press a button or not just operate a particular machine or whatever. And so I think that's why those programs work, is because they nest the soft skills in with the kind of pick an industry that's growing and is safe and it is operating in a lot of places. And to me, that's the model that works. You kind of just do both at the same time.
So I guess my question was, I appreciate and agree with all of that. In fact, we just published last week a volume on non-cognitive skills. One of your colleagues, Kadeen Norway, contributed to that volume, and we are all over that question with you. But I guess the thought behind my question was, we've thought of this as being a manufacturing issue, but the paper seems to suggest that we now have to be thinking about other categories of workers and who are going to be facing transitions. And that's what I was trying to get to, is what who do you think is going to be at bat next on this?
What did Yogi Berra say? Predictions are hard, especially about the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something like that. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence that jobs that require people to make kind of routine predictions, like sales jobs, seem to be at risk, because online retailers are getting pretty good at finding customers and predicting who needs what at what time. So I think that's another example. I think that automation will move up the white collar ladder slowly but surely. So the kinds of jobs that are kind of information workers that are somewhat routine, I think, are probably next at bat. But again, that's speculation. If people can predict these things, the world will be
I guess my point is that we need to kind of break out of this mindset that somehow transitions are about manufacturing.
I totally agree with that. 100%.
Yeah. Okay, Rachel, you want?
I was just going to say that I think COVID has really made that point so clear for so many people. I mean, when we think about our local economy in Boston, and you look at hospitality, which previously everyone was not predicted for massive disruption, and suddenly you have this influx of tens of thousands of workers who are looking for new work. And the workforce ecosystem in some form or another over the past year has really had to grapple with that conception of transferable skills, I think, in a way that they hadn't in the past, of looking at local training providers that were literally training people to become hotel workers or chefs, and then think creatively, well, what do we do right now with these folks who were about to graduate from those programs? And some of it is about how do you coach the individuals to kind of recognize the transferable skills that they've built. So yes, when I think about the ecosystem in Boston and some of the organizations that we've worked with, it's super helpful when they can kind of forge that bridge or pipeline. Say a hospitality program links up with the hospital and actually says, oh, here's a cohort of folks. There's growing demand right now during the pandemic for this set of kind of customer service facing roles to interact with families and keep in contact with people who are in the hospital because of COVID. But there's another piece of this for the worker themselves that's really building that kind of resiliency around just being able to recognize, here's the set of skills that I built in one context, and here's how they're actually applicable in another. And I mean, I think American workers right now have really demonstrated there's a lot of people out there who never thought that they would have to be moving from one occupation or one field into another, and have been creative and resilient and navigated that kind of change with grace. And I think that the kind of workforce professionals who have had to watch that are gonna learn something pretty interesting from this period of not only thinking so narrowly about the career ladder for someone specifically in the field they were trained for, but what does that mean more broadly for where they should look in the economy as a whole.
So I'm glad you brought up the workforce system and its response on another project Mason and I are working on right now. We're actually doing some interviews with state workforce, local workforce, community colleges, about the challenges they face with COVID response, what they've learned, what they're carrying forward. And as I was reflecting on that, I was thinking about, you made the point, Rachel, in your presentation about the decline in the number of one-stops, American Job Centers that have closed. And one thing that I think Mason and I are hearing in these interviews with these workforce system operators is, they're having to completely rethink how they interact with job seekers. people obviously for a while in many places couldn't get in to see anybody. So there was a big shift, very sudden shift, like every other aspect of our economic activity, to virtual settings. But I think that a lot of that's going to stick. So I guess my question, Mason, if I've mischaracterized any of that, you can weigh in and tell me, or add anything to that before Rachel and David respond. But we've talked a lot about place-based assistance, which I would assume would include bricks and mortar, kind of, I go to this place to get this service, rather than person-based. But don't we need a system that really is focusing on the needs of individual workers and helping them to find their way in these places? I mean, I don't want to set it up as an either or, because I think it's both, but that idea that we need to shift completely to a community level sort of understanding of this leaves out kind of the agency of the people who are looking for the jobs, and their interests and abilities, and where they want to go. So anyway, I'm throwing that out there. Mason, if you want to add anything to that, and then David and Rachel can take a minute to respond.
Well, I'll just add one interesting statistic. One of the states gave us that interviewed is that prior to COVID, roughly, I think it was 94% of their traffic was in person going into one-stop career centers. And this state has actually been open since August, so it's not like they've been closed down until just recently. They've been open since August, and their current traffic into one-stops is 14%. Another state we've talked to was doing traffic studies consistently for 3 years prior to COVID, and is getting ready now to do them every 3 months to decide to make some decisions on the mix of services, both in terms of place-based versus virtual. But what we kind of were hearing anecdotally, and we're going to be digging in a little bit, maybe doing some case studies on this because it was such interesting information, but anecdotally, states are seeming to indicate that even when given the choice, people are looking for more virtual kinds of services and not necessarily to walk in, which makes for interesting implications for things like the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which mandates that you have to have a physical, comprehensive one-stop in each local area. Well, that may be, again, another kind of federal mandate that creates a built-in inefficiency and isn't aligned to the customer way that locals need to be able to, and states need to be able to react to changing conditions. So thoughts, Rachel and David, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, David and I, through this initiative we've been running called Skill-Based at Harvard, in collaboration with Harvard students and staff, have been working closely with the one-stops in Massachusetts and the Mass Hire network and their staff over the course of the crisis. We had this team of Harvard students that built a really interesting tech tool that's helping to curate and aggregate free resources on foundational skills that the one-stop staff could then help distribute and disseminate for job seekers in their region, and sort of help handle some of the transition to the virtual atmosphere. So I've sat in on some of these interviews as well with the job center staff, and seeing how their own kind of daily flow of work has really been disrupted, how they think about what it means to serve someone looking for work in a virtual environment, I think was relatively under leveraged prior to this crisis. I think you're right, Mason, about, look, some of the models are outdated. There's ways in which the fragmentation of the system, I think we should question some things. Say, like, you need to develop does it matter based on which geography you're in, the resume development seminar, should that be customized to your local region, or do we want to take the overall best person who's out there on doing resume review and kind of make that accessible to job seekers across the state or across the country? Like, what does it look like to achieve some of the economies of scale that are that are facilitated and enabled through technology. I think like one of the biggest research questions are going to be like, what's the complement between technology and human support that is the right balance? Which of the services can most easily and best be scaled virtually and really don't require a human, and which ones are going to need where we can give more focused support, more coaching, more resources, both at a service level and both for the types of workers that have really been identified to need that extra support. I know that like RSEA and some of the programs out there at least have these objectives at a broad level, but COVID has provided a really interesting kind of testing laboratory for those questions. And I'm hopeful that we'll kind of like be able to evaluate and look backwards on what's been learned about efficacy of the types of services in the different settings. I'll say the one thing that I'm concerned about regarding this brick and mortar question is the community aspect. We talked a lot about the mental health effects of being unemployed and how you can get into these cycles of depression and anxiety, and having peer support really can make a difference of other people going through the same thing at the same time, trading advice with each other, building a social network in your community that can help you connect to jobs. I haven't seen great examples yet of that being replicated online. I think there's certainly attempts to do so. But if you think about the role that the job centers played in the Great Recession of really being a place where you could have somewhere to go in the morning, meet other people who are going through the same thing, and kind of get that peer support, whether it be from the staff or just from others in your community. That's one where I think it will be interesting to see if there are effective models that are developed virtually, but it seems to me that that linkage between like how do you meet other people in your community who can help you in the job search is a little bit harder to replicate through Zoom. I'll stop there though, and see if David has anything.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And what struck me about our conversations with the local workforce folks is the need to kind of reserve the capacity of the workforce system for those who really need it. Maybe it's the 14% who really they need that engagement in order for it to work, for the support to work. But having a system that's also flexible enough so that we aren't jamming everybody through one funnel, because we don't have the capacity for that. We're not likely to have the capacity for that, but really have something that's flexible that allows those who are, know where they're going, know where they're trying to go, they know what they're interested in, they can transition quickly to training and employment, and other people who are going to need more intensive support, that we've got some capacity there to help those workers. So last question from me, and then we've got a couple questions from the audience that I wanted to give you. But so when you think, one of the things that when we set out on this project, I asked that you guys think about is what can we learn from other countries about effective practices for supporting work transitions when we've got layoffs and factories closing and offshoring or whatever's going on. But what anything that you see out there that you think the United States ought to be looking at closely in terms of models?
You want to start, Rachel? Go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to take a first stab. I mean, I don't think this is groundbreaking, but have always been struck by European countries like Germany and Switzerland's apprenticeship models and how tight the linkage between the training and the job at the end of the funnel is. And in the US, that transition is not often smooth, that the employers are not involved at the first stage of the training, and therefore it's not like when you complete that you very quickly are placed into a job. And so I think focusing at that kind of connection point between what is the intersection between the training and the actual job at the end of the funnel is a place where the US traditionally has struggled, and we can look at other systems that do a much better job of making that pathway smoother.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would just add, it sort of goes back to something Mason said earlier about the definition of a sectoral program. I think that's the right level, because to me, a sectoral program is like industry level or something like that. If you train for an individual employer only, that job tends to be more fragile. It's very dependent on how that employer does things. It's too specific. If you train at a very broad level, which is kind of what the US does, like everybody goes to college and does the same thing, then you're not adequately meeting the needs. Sectoral is something in between, because then you get, in the ideal world, and they do this in a lot of the European countries, you get a group of employers together who have common needs, and you think about what is the kind of broad skill set that workers need in this sector. And then if they end up going from one employer to the other, many of those skills transfer because they've kind of agreed on what it should look like at the end of the funnel. And so some compromise notion like that mirrors, at least in its end goal. I don't think, because of federalism, it's never going to look exactly like a European country, but something that mirrors it in terms of a goal, I think would be a good place to start.
Okay, great. Thank you. So one of the questions we have here from the audience is, can the speakers address issues related to variation among displaced workers, especially in the number of years they might have remaining in the labor market and their willingness / comfort level with retraining? That's clearly an issue across the developed world, where we've got aging demographics. We've got a lot of people approaching retirement age, and a need to try to keep those people active as long as we can. So what about that? What do we do for older workers? Anyone?
Well, it's a great question. And again, it sort of speaks to the anecdotal example I gave. I think, again, this is where, sometimes I think we do a little bit of a disservice in the way we handle dislocated worker programs, where we sort of say, well, if there's more training, and it's kind of like that's the panacea that's going to fix everything. And I think, again, it gets down to building a response system of economic development, community colleges and education, workforce development professionals, and providing them with the tools and the evidence and information about how best to work on an individual basis. I think clearly kind of at the heart of the question is, and again, this is not easy, right? I mean, it's a struggle when you have somebody 60 years old that's just been laid off from the job they were in 30 years and expect them to now spend a year or two retraining, and when they're thinking, I just got to get to Medicare and Social Security, right? And so I think it is incumbent upon us to have very flexible and individualized approaches that try to meet workers in different situations where they are. And I think this is really where it gets to gets to some of what Rachel said earlier, where I think sometimes our local folks aren't as connected to the demand side as they need to be. I mean, I think there's plenty of evidence that says we sometimes struggle with employer engagement, with truly getting employers. And if you're in a labor market that doesn't have a lot of large sort of anchor employers, it really is a struggle, because a lot of small, mid-sized businesses are just trying to survive, especially when there's a COVID type crisis in their communities. So it becomes very difficult to how do you connect to that demand side and steer people in the right direction. But I think generally speaking, all you can do is don't pretend that training is the answer for everybody. We heard Rachel and David talk about job search assistance, for instance, but I think really trying to connect with employer intermediaries in communities like chambers of commerce, industry associations, and others, trying to really, and I call it a business feedback loop. I think sometimes the mistake we make is we say it's a one-way street. We need to hear from business. What are their needs? That's something you'll hear. I've been involved in some projects that's not the case. The community colleges and workforce development professionals need to be providing data and evidence to employers about what kind of credentials are available and what do they mean, what kinds of education, training, types of opportunities can they provide, and what does that mean, so that when a worker shows up at their workplace looking for a job, that employer understands what the community college or the workforce development system has done with that individual in terms of getting their skill levels up to a certain level. So I think it's that kind of individualized response and really having the understanding of how to engage with employers, how to connect to the demand side, and what is the evidence around these sectoral approaches and how do you develop and create them?
One quick thing I'll just add, not endorsing it, but one interesting policy that we encountered in this work is a relatively underutilized piece of trade adjustment assistance is wage insurance for workers over 50 who were laid off in a trade-related displacement. And it's basically the idea that you can provide earnings that replicate a share of their pre-displacement earnings if they take another job that pays less than what they were making prior to that job loss. So that's a policy area that I'm going to be watching, I think, over the next few years to see what we can learn from it, because Ben Hyman, whose work we cited in the report, has also been doing some work on this question. And I think initial findings were that it does increase employment rates amongst older workers compared to the control group who did not receive the wage insurance program. But it's a relatively very small share right now of workers who actually tap into that.
Brent, real quick, I think that's absolutely, that gets to my earlier comment about transitional benefits. I'm glad Rachel raised that. Because again, having been engaged very heavily in the welfare reform after the 1990s in the state of Utah, one of the key pieces that made welfare reform initially successful was transitional benefits. That if a single parent with children received employment, he or she, most of the time it was she's, did not lose their transitional childcare and Medicaid benefits for their family. And so it provided the incentives to get into the labor market and then work toward upward mobility and eventually getting self-sufficient and off of all those other government benefits. We do not have a similar kind of rubric in our dislocated worker programs, especially TAA in particular. I tried with some very limited success back in 2007 to do this, but I think what Rachel's getting is exactly right. I think if there's one policy we could really work on at the federal level is how do we create easier transitions for people to get back in the labor market and not have it be an all or nothing kind of proposition. You're on mute, Brent.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Exit question.
We need worker training for Brent.
Yeah. Move the mouse, click on the mute button. So exit question here for us is, we've talked a lot about long-term issues. This is something that's come up in the Twitter feed. We've talked a lot about long-term reforms. And the question, good question being asked here is, what can we do now? What kinds of policy changes could be made that would give, that would immediately kind of free up the system? I'm going to let you think about that for a second, and then I'll talk about an idea that Mason and I have developed around the possibility of some sort of waiver authority for states to begin the process of redesigning their systems. Not attempting actually to go in and fix this all at once, but to say to states that are interested, that have leaders, governors, and legislatures that are interested in taking this issue on, giving them more flexibility to draw outside the lines, as it were, in terms of what Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act or other federal education training programs require, so that we can kind of get the garden, sort of blooming out there, and see what kind of flowers we get out of that when the federal government kind of maintains its presence in terms of resources, but kind of steps back on the regulatory front to allow states to experiment more. So that's my short-term idea. Anybody else have a short-term idea for supporting worker transitions?
Brent, I'll jump in here real quick because I think it's a great question, and I think often we reflect on the longer term problems without recognizing that there are a lot of really good things happening too, even now with COVID. And I think one of the things from a shorter term is that states really do have a lot of opportunities to sort of step in and fill the void, not necessarily with a reliance on the federal funding in order to do it. A lot of states are now, I think, moving toward funding for tuition assistance. I love West Virginia, which has what they call the HEAPS. They have West Virginia Invest and West Virginia HEAPS. That's HEAPS, the acronym, where you get $2,000 for short-term worker retraining. I do work with community college in West Virginia and see that program being used a lot and being very effective and helpful with getting people into very short-term credential training. So I do think from a shorter term basis, I hold most hope at the state and local levels that I think if you have entrepreneurial people, there are a lot of things that they can actually do. And one of the things you and I, just to pitch an AEI, the AEI work we're doing, Brent, as you know, we're developing a toolkit right now around some innovative practices that states have done around integration of their workforce systems, and provide that as a means to educate other states about there are current flexibilities, even with sort of the laws we have now, that they can take and to improve these kinds of programs in the more near term. And so that's something you and I are obviously, and others are working on. So I really hold a lot of hope that at the state and local levels, there's a lot of really good things happening and can continue to happen to address these issues.
I'll add just two quick thoughts. The first is that often the kind of navigational role in this system gets overlooked, and we don't have the funding streams to support it. But there's a lot of good evidence that we saw around investing in coaches, investing in guidance and mentorship and support to try to figure out what's the next stage or the path that's best for a worker. And you could allocate funding at a state level to support those types of investments. One of the pieces of the American Families Plan that I'm most enthusiastic about, that I think often gets overlooked, is the investment in kind of the wraparound service piece. The childcare, the mental health, emergency aid, all of these things that have often gotten overlooked in the training dialogue. And when we think about community colleges that are actually serving students with the fewest financial resources, investments right now to make it easier to complete your program, and then once you're on the job to stay in a job, I think will have ROI for the longer run.
Great. David, any last thoughts to share with us?
Sure. I mean, I think that the question is a good one, which is what can we do in the short run? I would just say that all of these things are true, what folks have said, but I also think that part of the issue we have is that we're always thinking in the short run. So the answer might very well be, we're already doing what we could be doing in the short run. Now let's build the infrastructure so that when the next crisis happens, we have a better response in place. And so that's kind of a grumpy old man answer, but that's kind of what was asked. So there we go.
That's great. Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you, each of you, for taking this time out to be with us this afternoon, for the great work that the team of the Wiener Center did on this report. And just for our audience, obviously this will be available on the AEI webpage. Share it with people that you think might find it interesting. I also want to say that this is not the end of anything, that our intention is to continue this collaboration to push this conversation forward. You know, we're not going to change anything overnight. It's going to require a sustained effort, some serious policy development, some compromises on issues that, you know, this is pretty bread and butter, but there are going to be differences in perspective. But we're looking forward to that the continuation of this dialogue and in trying to support our lawmakers, our officials in the executive branch, at the state level as well, in creating better and easier transitions for people who are displaced from their jobs. So again, thank you, all of you, for coming, and I thank our audience for their attention and their questions, and we will see you back here in the future for more conversations about work.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.